In the heart of Dublin, at St. James's Gate, there is a piece of parchment that defies the very notion of time. Dated December 31st, 1759, it is a lease for a dilapidated brewery, signed by a man named Arthur Guinness. The duration of this lease? 9,000 years. Most entrepreneurs dream of a decade of success. Arthur Guinness planned for eternity. This single act of audacious confidence didn't just create a beverage. It birthed a dynasty that would become synonymous with Ireland itself. A name etched into the black silk of every pint of stout poured across the globe. For over 2 centuries, the Guinness family represented the pinnacle of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. They were the Rockefellers of the Old World, a lineage of visionaries, philanthropists, and titans of industry. They built hospitals, restored cathedrals, and provided their workers with benefits that were unheard of in the Victorian era. To the outside world, being a Guinness was the ultimate winning ticket in the lottery of life. Their wealth was so vast it seemed unburnable. Their influence so deep it reached the highest corridors of British power. But behind the iron gates of their sprawling estates and the velvet curtains of their London mansions, a different story was being written, one whispered in hushed tones in the social clubs of the elite. It is the story of the Guinness curse. It is a narrative where gold turns to lead, where brilliance is shadowed by madness, and where the very name that brought such immense fortune seemed to demand a terrible price in blood and tears. How does a family that conquered the commercial world become a gallery of tragedies? To understand the curse, one must first understand the height from which they fell. The 19th century saw the Guinnesses ascend to a level of prestige that few families in history have ever touched. Benjamin Lee Guinness became the richest man in Ireland, transforming the brewery into the largest in the world. His son, Edward Cecil, was created Earl of Iveagh, cementing their transition from trade to nobility. They were the quintessential Victorian success story, pious, industrious, and boundlessly generous. Yet, as the 20th century dawned, the shadows began to lengthen. The first cracks in the golden facade appeared not in the ledgers of the brewery, but in the brutal arena of international politics. In 1944, the world watched in horror as Walter Edward Guinness, Lord Moyne, a man of immense intellect and diplomatic stature, was gunned down in the streets of Cairo by Zionist assassins. It was a shocking, violent intrusion into a family that had previously known only the quiet dignity of wealth. But this assassination wasn't the opening movement of their sorrow. The curse had already taken root in the 1930s. Brian Guinness had suffered severe public humiliation when his wife, Diana Mitford, abandoned him to marry a fascist leader in a wedding attended by Adolf Hitler. And in 1937, the brilliant racing driver and Guinness heir, Kenelm Lee Guinness, tragically gassed himself to death while suffering from paranoia. The murder of Lord Moyne in 1944 wasn't the beginning. It was simply the curse mutating into its most violent political form. As the decades rolled on, the tragedies shifted from the political to the personal, and from the elders to the youth. The 1960s brought the meteoric rise and tragic fall of Tara Brown, the golden boy of the London counterculture. A friend to the Beatles and a symbol of aristocratic rebellion, his life was extinguished in a twisted wreck of a Lotus Elan at the age of 21. His death was immortalized in the haunting lyrics of A Day in the Life, but for the Guinnesses, it was another link in a chain of misfortune that seemed impossible to break. The curse spared no one. It reached into the minds of the brilliant, leading to bouts of crippling depression and sudden violent ends. From the tragic leap of Lady Henrietta Guinness from a bridge in Italy to the mysterious deaths and drug-fueled collapses of other heirs, the pattern became undeniable. Even the family's ironclad reputation for integrity was not immune. As the 1980s Guinness share trading fraud dragged the family name through the mud of financial scandal, proving that even a 9,000 years legacy could be tarnished in a matter of months. Is the Guinness curse a supernatural debt owed for such overwhelming success? Or is it something more human, the crushing weight of an impossible legacy? When you are born into a name that is literally written on every street corner, when your ancestors are giants who built the very world you walk upon, where do you go? How do you find a purpose when everything has already been achieved? Today, we dive into the history of the Guinness family. We will trace the line from Arthur's ambitious signature to the modern day, exploring the heights of their philanthropic glory and the depths of their most private despairs. This is not just a story of a brewery. It is a grand saga of wealth, power, and the haunting reality that sometimes the most expensive thing you can own is a famous last name. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Guinness ascent, one must first perform a forensic examination of the volatile economic canvas of mid-18th century Ireland. Dublin in the 1750s was a city defined by a jarring duality. It was a bustling colonial hub, the second city of the British Empire, yet it remained a place where industrial infrastructure was in its painful infancy. The brewing industry at this time was not the monolithic giant we know today. It was a fragmented landscape dominated by over 70 small-scale artisanal operations, all of which were being systematically strangled by the massive importation of English pale ales. For a local entrepreneur, the barriers to entry were not just high, they were nearly insurmountable. Capital was scarce, the tax regime was predatory, and the risk of total bankruptcy was an ever-present shadow. But in this precarious climate, beer was far more than a mere social lubricant. It was a critical, life-sustaining commodity. With urban groundwater frequently contaminated by sewage and the gin craze ravaging the health and productivity of the urban poor, the production of high-quality, clean fermented beverages was viewed as both a moral imperative and a massive untapped gap in the market. Arthur Guinness, inheriting a modest sum of £100 from his godfather, Archbishop Arthur Price, did not merely see a small business opportunity to support a family, but before the 9,000-year lease, the family's origin itself was cloaked in myth. For generations, they claimed descent from the aristocratic Magennis clan. It wasn't until 2007 that DNA testing revealed their true roots. The McCartans, and a line of ordinary tenant farmers, he possessed a rare, systemic vision. He identified a structural void in the Irish economy, a lack of a standardized, reliable domestic product that could withstand the onslaught of British imports, and he intended to fill it with something far more permanent than a temporary commercial venture. On the cold morning of December 31st, 1759, Arthur executed what remains, to this day, one of the most audacious and strategically brilliant real estate transactions in commercial history. He signed a lease for the St. James's Gate Brewery, a 4-acre site that was, at the time, little more than a collection of dilapidated copper vats and crumbling stone walls. The terms of the lease were so extraordinary they bordered on the absurd. An annual rent of £45 for a duration of exactly 9,000 years. From a rigorous economic perspective, this was a masterstroke of long-term capital hedging and risk mitigation. By locking in a fixed, nominal overhead cost for 9 millennia, Arthur effectively neutralized the catastrophic risk of land inflation. In an era where Dublin was beginning to expand and property values were poised for a secular uptrend, Guinness secured his means of production at a stagnant price. This allowed every future ounce of surplus value generated by the brewery to be diverted away from rent and instead reinvested into cutting-edge technology, steam power, and aggressive scaling. While his competitors were perpetually subject to the whims of landlords and the volatility of the real estate market, Arthur had created a permanent, cost-controlled sanctuary for his capital. This 9,000 years lease was not just a legal curiosity. It was a profound declaration of generational intent, a multi-generational insurance policy against the inherent uncertainty of the future. The early decades at St. James's Gate were a period of intense research and development, market surveillance, and painful trial and error. At the time, the Dublin elite and the growing middle class possessed a sophisticated preference for London porter, a dark, hop-heavy beer that derived its name from the street porters who favored its hearty nature. Porter was the high-tech beverage of the 18th century. It was easier to transport over long distances and possessed a shelf life that far exceeded traditional local ales. Arthur Guinness recognized a classic import substitution opportunity. He understood that if he could replicate, and eventually surpass, the quality of the London product on Irish soil, he could eliminate the massive shipping costs and tariffs that burdened his English rivals. However, this pivot required a monumental shift in supply chain management and technical expertise. Porter production required roasted barley, a highly specific fermentation process, and, crucially, a scale of production that could drive the unit cost low enough to compete with the London giants. For years, Arthur operated as a dual-track producer, brewing both traditional ales and the experimental porter. But by the late 1700s, he made a radical, all-in strategic decision that would define the company's DNA. He ceased all production of Dublin ale to focus exclusively on porter. In modern economic theory, this is a textbook case of niche specialization and the pursuit of a comparative advantage. By focusing 100% of his industrial capacity on a single, high-demand product, he achieved economies of scale and technical mastery that no other brewer in Ireland could dream of matching. As the 18th century drew to a close, Arthur's role evolved from that of a master brewer to a sophisticated navigator of the complex regulatory and political maze of the British Empire. The economy of the time was heavily dictated by protectionist tariffs, shifting excise taxes, and the whims of the Irish Parliament. Guinness proved to be as much a diplomat and lobbyist as he was a businessman. He navigated the turbulent waters of Grattan's Parliament and the eventual Act of Union in 1800, ensuring his business interests remained aligned with the prevailing political winds. He masterfully advocated for lower taxes on beer by framing it as a healthy and moral alternative to the social scourge of hard spirits like whiskey and gin. In doing so, he effectively used social advocacy as a sharp tool for market expansion, positioning his product as a virtuous choice for the patriotic consumer. By the time Arthur Guinness passed the torch to his son, Arthur II, in 1803, he had accomplished the impossible. He had transformed a crumbling 4-acre plot into a high-output industrial engine that was the envy of the British Isles. He had established a distribution network that utilized the newly constructed Grand Canal systems to move his black gold from the heart of Dublin to the furthest reaches of the Irish countryside. The Black Pearl of Dublin was no longer just a drink found in a local tavern. It had become a dominant economic force, a private entity that was becoming as stable and enduring as the state itself. Arthur had built more than a brewery. He had built a financial fortress, setting the stage for a dynasty that would eventually become one of the wealthiest on earth, even as they began to walk unwittingly toward the dark shadows of their own monumental success. As the 18th century progressed into its final turbulent decades, the Guinness operation at St. James's Gate underwent a profound metamorphosis, shifting from a precarious survivalist startup to a dominant, vertically integrated industrial force. However, the true genius of Arthur Guinness during this era lay not merely in the chemistry of brewing porter, but in his aggressive and almost predatory protection of the natural monopolies required for mass production. In the rigorous world of 18th century industrial economics, the most volatile and valuable commodity was not barley, yeast, or hops. It was water. To maintain a high-output industrial brewery, Arthur required an uninterrupted high-pressure flow of water from the city basin, a public resource fiercely guarded by the Dublin Corporation. This structural dependency led to one of the most legendary and legally significant confrontations in the history of global commerce, the Great Water War of 1775. The conflict erupted when the Dublin Corporation, citing unpaid taxes and disputed usage rights, attempted to physically sever the brewery's connection to the city's water mains. For any other merchant, this would have been a moment for desperate litigation or humble negotiation. But Arthur Guinness understood a fundamental rule of industrial power: infrastructure is destiny. When the corporation's bailiffs and workmen arrived at St. James's Gate with iron bars and shovels to cut the flow, Arthur did not wait for his solicitors. He personally charged into the fray, allegedly seizing a pickaxe from a workman and threatening anyone who dared to touch his supply line. This was not a mere display of Irish temper. It was a calculated act of asset protection. By physically defending his access to the means of production, Arthur established a precedent of corporate sovereignty. The resulting legal settlement, which solidified his water rights for the remainder of the 9,000-year lease, ensured that his industrial engine would never be throttled by bureaucratic whims. In economic terms, he had secured his most vital raw material at zero marginal cost for centuries to come. Beyond the raw defense of resources, Arthur's second strategic pillar was a revolutionary mastery of the logistics frontier. During the late 1700s, Ireland was a logistical nightmare, plagued by rutted mud roads, internal banditry, and a fragmented transport system that made the distribution of heavy liquid goods prohibitively expensive. Most Dublin brewers remained parochial, confined to the thirsty but geographically limited city market. Arthur, however, possessed a continental ambition. He recognized that the newly proposed Grand Canal system was not just a public works project, but a value chain multiplier, as he became one of the largest private shareholders and financiers of the Grand Canal Company. By diverting his profits into the very infrastructure that would carry his product, Arthur performed a brilliant feat of capital recycling. The canals allowed Guinness to move massive tonnages of black gold across the Irish Midlands at a fraction of the cost of traditional horse-drawn haulage. This gave him an insurmountable first-mover advantage. By the time his rivals realized the potential of the inland waterways, Guinness had already secured the most strategic docking facilities and established a network of exclusive distribution hubs, effectively owning the rural Irish market before a single competitor could arrive. Simultaneously, Arthur was pioneering a radical new model of labor economics and human capital management. In an era characterized by the brutal exploitation of the working class, Guinness implemented a system of paternalistic capitalism. He recognized that the complexity of brewing porter on an industrial scale required a level of technical consistency that couldn't be achieved with transient, disgruntled labor. He began paying his workers nearly 20% above the prevailing Dublin wage. But the true innovation lay in the non-wage benefits. He provided free on-site medical care, contributed to funeral expenses for employees' families, and established a proto-pension fund. Economically, this was a sophisticated strategy to eliminate labor turnover and suppress the rising tide of industrial unrest and trade unionism. By transforming his workforce into a corporate family, he ensured that the trade secrets of St. James's Gate remained within the walls, creating an internal stability that became the bedrock of the brand's global reliability. The final, and perhaps most subtle dimension of Arthur's expansion was the accumulation of social and political capital. As the brewery's profits began to exceed the GDP of some small nations, Arthur understood that extreme wealth in a colonial society required a shield of respectability. He systematically embedded the Guinness name into the moral and social fabric of the Protestant ascendancy. He became a founding governor of the Meath Hospital and a primary benefactor of the first Sunday schools in Ireland. This was strategic philanthropy at its finest. By positioning the Guinness family as the guardians of public health and morality, he created a psychological brand moat. To attack Guinness was no longer just to attack a brewer. It was to attack an institution of Irish progress. He masterfully lobbied the Irish Parliament to maintain high taxes on whiskey, framing it as a social evil, while keeping taxes on beer low, framing it as a nutritious, liquid bread for the working man. It was a masterful alignment of private profit with public virtue. By the time of Arthur's death in 1803, the economic engine of St. James's Gate was producing an unprecedented 20,000 barrels of porter annually. He had navigated the existential threats of the 1798 rebellion and the 1800 Act of Union, emerging with his capital expanded and his market dominance absolute. He left behind a fortune of £23,000 in liquid cash, a massive sum for the time, but the true legacy was the economic flywheel he had set in motion. He had successfully transitioned the family from the medieval guild system to the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution. However, as the wealth reached a critical mass, the seeds of a future paradox were being sown. The very success that Arthur had engineered, the vast estates, the political influence, the unassailable reputation, was creating a golden cage for the generations to follow. The 9,000-year lease was no longer just a contract. It was a destiny that would eventually demand a psychological toll as immense as the fortune it produced, setting the stage for the dark, multi-generational tragedies that would later be known as the Guinness Curse. The death of Arthur Guinness I in 1803 did not signal a period of mourning for the brewery at St. James's Gate. Instead, it marked the beginning of an unprecedented industrial acceleration. The transition of power to his son, Arthur Guinness II, was a masterclass in corporate succession. While the founder had been the visionary architect of the 9,000-year lease, Arthur II was the operational genius who would navigate the firm through the choppy waters of the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent industrial boom of the 19th century. Under his stewardship, the Guinness name would transition from a successful local stout to an international financial juggernaut, firmly establishing the family as the unofficial royal family of Ireland. From a macroeconomic perspective, the early 19th century presented a unique set of challenges and opportunities. The Act of Union in 1800 had fundamentally altered the trade relationship between Ireland and Great Britain. While many Irish industries withered under the direct competition of English manufacturers, Guinness thrived. This was due to a relentless focus on quality control and market dominance. Arthur II realized that in a world of increasing industrial standardization, the consistency of the product was the ultimate competitive advantage. He invested heavily in the chemistry of brewing, moving away from the trial and error methods of the 18th century and toward a more rigorous, scientific approach. By 1815, Guinness was no longer just a brewery. It was a high-tech laboratory where every barrel was a testament to mathematical precision. The pinnacle of this scientific rigor was the work of William Seeley Gossett. A chemist at the brewery, Gossett developed the student's t-test, a foundational tool of modern statistics, while solving the problem of quality control in small beer samples. Fearing that competitors would realize the advantage of using higher mathematics in brewing, Guinness forbade him from publishing under his real name. Thus, one of the world's most vital scientific breakthroughs was born in a brewery lab, published under the humble pseudonym Student to protect a corporate secret. The period between 1803 and 1850 saw a staggering increase in production volume. In 1803, the brewery produced roughly 20,000 barrels annually. By the time Arthur II passed the reins to his son, Benjamin Lee Guinness, in 1855, that number had surged to nearly 100,000 barrels. This growth was fueled by an aggressive expansion into the London market. Arthur II understood that the British capital was the financial heart of the world, and to conquer London was to conquer the global trade network. He utilized the expanding British naval and merchant fleets to export Guinness Extra Stout to the furthest reaches of the empire, from the Caribbean to the military outposts in India. This was the birth of Guinness as a global brand, a name that could be recognized in a bustling London pub or a remote colonial port. But this expansion wasn't as seamless as the ledgers suggest. The family faced a hushed-up crisis when Arthur III, partnering with his brother Benjamin, became entangled in a scandalous affair with an 18-year-old male clerk. Secret payments and blackmail threatened the empire, forcing Arthur III to quietly step down and take a buyout, leaving Benjamin solely in charge. However, the expansion was not without its internal struggles. The 1840s brought the Great Famine to Ireland, a catastrophe that decimated the population and crippled the domestic economy. During this dark era, the Guinness family faced a profound ethical and economic dilemma. While the country starved, the brewery continued to profit. During this horrific era, the Guinness family's response was chillingly pragmatic. While millions starved and the country withered, the family had tons of barley crops. But instead of offering relief, the landowners hired armed guards to violently protect their precious barley, ensuring it was shipped directly to England for maximum profit. The family then weaponized this massive influx of cash to buy up cheap, distressed land and estates all over Ireland from those struggling to survive. While their people perished, the Guinness empire thrived, building a fortune on the very ground of a national tragedy. Benjamin Lee Guinness achieved what his grandfather could have only dreamed of. He was created a baronet, elevating the family into the aristocracy. But this triumph was followed by immediate chaos. In 1868, Sir Benjamin died, triggering a monumental succession battle between his children, a power vacuum so dramatic it recently inspired the hit Netflix series House of Guinness. This was the ultimate social pivot. The Guinnesses were no longer men of trade. They were landed gentry, members of the aristocracy. This elevation brought with it a shift in the family's economic behavior. They began to acquire vast estates, such as the magnificent Ashford Castle in County Mayo. These acquisitions were not just displays of vanity. They were asset diversification. By moving their brewing profits into land and titles, the family protected their wealth from the inherent volatility of the beverage market. This era also birthed their visual empire. In 1862, they adopted the 14th century Brian Boru harp as their trademark, a move so iconic that when the Irish Free State formed, the government had to face their official harp the opposite way to avoid copyright infringement. They later added the famous toucan mascot and revolutionized beer pouring with the invention of the nitrogen widget, winning a Queen's Award for technological achievement. They were building a multi-asset fortress that would sustain the family for generations. The scaling of the empire reached its zenith under Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Earl of Eviog. In 1886, he made the monumental decision to take the company public on the London Stock Exchange. The initial public offering, IPO, was a sensation. It was oversubscribed 20 times over, and the company was valued at over £6 million, an astronomical sum for the Victorian era. This move provided the family with a massive influx of liquid capital while allowing them to maintain a controlling interest in the firm. Edward Cecil became the richest man in Ireland, a titan of the Gilded Age whose wealth rivaled that of the American Vanderbilts or the European Rothschilds. Yet, as the gold piled higher, the golden cage began to tighten. The transition from a family-run business to a public corporation brought with it a level of scrutiny and pressure that the earlier generations had never faced. The family was now accountable to shareholders, and the Guinness name was no longer just a family identity. It was a financial asset that had to be protected at all costs. The expectations were immense. Every Guinness heir was born with a silver spoon, but that spoon was weighted with the crushing responsibility of maintaining a legendary legacy. The 19th century was the era of the Titans, the period when the Guinnesses built the peak of their mountain. But as any climber knows, the higher the peak, the thinner the air, and the more dangerous the descent. The very wealth that bought them castles and titles was also creating an environment of isolation and expectation that would soon lead to the first cracks in the family's mental and emotional health, setting the stage for the tragedies of the 20th century. As the 19th century progressed into its final glittering decades, the expansion of the Guinness family was no longer measured solely by the millions of barrels of stout exiting St. James's Gate, but by the profound and systematic accumulation of social and political capital. Under the stewardship of Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness and his son, Edward Cecil Guinness, the family executed a dual-track strategy that remains a textbook study in dynastic preservation. While the brewery was being transformed into a global industrial titan with unmatched technical precision, the family name was being forged into an indispensable pillar of the British Empire's social hierarchy. This was the era of Guinness as an institution, a period where the boundaries between private enterprise, national philanthropy, and aristocratic power became indistinguishably blurred. However, beneath this polished exterior of baronetcies, peerages, and unprecedented dividends, the structural pressures of the golden cage began to solidify, creating a psychological vacuum that would eventually foster the tragedies of the 20th century. The defining characteristic of this period was the family's mastery of strategic philanthropy on a scale that few private entities in history had ever dared to attempt. Benjamin Lee Guinness's most enduring legacy was not a financial ledger, but the total restoration of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin between 1860 and 1865. Unlike the American tycoons of the Gilded Age, who often turned to philanthropy in their twilight years to atone for their robber baron reputations, the Guinnesses integrated charity into their growth strategy from the start. By restoring the spiritual heart of Ireland, Benjamin Lee wasn't just being a good Christian, he was laundering the new money stain of a brewer to secure a seat among the ancient peerage. It was a masterclass in reputation management, turning industrial profits into an unassailable cultural legacy. From a cold, macroeconomic perspective, this was far more than a gesture of religious devotion. It was a masterstroke of reputation management. By single-handedly funding the restoration of Ireland's national cathedral at a cost exceeding £150,000, an astronomical sum at the time, Benjamin Lee effectively bypassed the slow-moving state and church bureaucracies, positioning the Guinness family as the ultimate sovereign guardians of Irish heritage. This act did more than save a crumbling Gothic monument. It sanctified the Guinness wealth. In an era of rising Irish nationalism and fierce temperance movements that attacked the evils of drink, the Guinnesses became untouchable. They had successfully linked the consumption of their product with the physical preservation of the nation's soul. The cathedral became a permanent stone and mortar advertisement for the benevolence, morality, and permanence of the dynasty. Simultaneously, within the iron gates of St. James's Gate, the family was pioneering a radical model of paternalistic capitalism that was decades ahead of its time. As the brewery evolved into a self-sustaining city within a city, the Guinnesses created a comprehensive social safety net for their thousands of employees. They understood that the complexity of brewing at a global scale required more than just labor. It required technical loyalty. They built model housing estates like the Eviog Trust, providing workers with clean, affordable, and dignified living conditions that stood in stark contrast to Dublin's notorious, disease-ridden slums. They established the first corporate medical departments, offering free health care, dental work, and even primary education for the children of their staff. Economically, this was a strategy to ensure labor continuity. This benevolence, however, carried a strategic undertone of paternalistic control. By providing for every aspect of a worker's life, from the cradle to the grave, the family created a workforce that was deeply loyal, yet utterly dependent. In an era of rising socialist fervor, the Guinnesses didn't just buy labor, they bought social stability. By becoming the sole provider of housing, health, and education, they effectively insulated their empire from the trade union radicalism and strikes that paralyzed their competitors. It was human capital management in its most advanced and perhaps most controlling form, ensuring that the Guinness way remained undisputed for generations. The accumulation of social capital reached its absolute zenith with Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Earl of Ivey. Edward Cecil was the embodiment of the Victorian industrial titan. In 1886, he made the monumental decision to take the company public on the London Stock Exchange. The initial public offering, IPO, of Guinness was not merely a financial transaction. It was a global coronation. The listing was oversubscribed by 20 times, as investors around the world scrambled to own a piece of the black gold. The IPO valued the company at over £6 million, providing the family with a massive influx of liquid capital while Edward Cecil maintained a dominant, controlling interest. This move allowed the family to diversify their wealth out of the brewery and into a global portfolio of stocks, bonds, and vast land holdings. Edward Cecil became the richest man in Ireland, possessing an estate, Elvedon Hall, that covered 23,000 acres and required a staff of hundreds to maintain. He moved among kings and emperors, his influence so vast that he was often consulted on matters of national policy, as if he were a branch of government himself. Yet, it was during this period of absolute peak power that the structural cracks in the golden cage began to appear. The transition from a family-run business to a public corporation brought a new, cold reality: the burden of public benchmark. The family was no longer just responsible for their own success. They were now the stewards of a massive public trust and a global financial standard. For the heirs of the third and fourth generations, the Guinness name was no longer just a family identity. It was a heavy, suffocating mantle of expectation. Every action, every public statement, and every private hobby was now a matter of shareholder concern and national interest. The pressure to be a Guinness, to be a paragon of industrial brilliance, philanthropic virtue, and aristocratic dignity, was immense. While patriarchs like Edward Cecil thrived in this high-pressure environment, the younger generations began to feel the weight of a 9,000-year destiny they had not chosen. The family's wealth had created a world of absolute insulation, a gilded vacuum where every need was met and every obstacle was smoothed over by money. In this environment of total privilege, the raw, survivalist drive that had fueled Arthur I and Arthur II began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of purposelessness and psychological drift. The very success that had bought them castles, titles, and a place in the annals of history was also creating a fertile ground for isolation and depression. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Guinnesses were standing at the summit of the world, seemingly invincible. But the air at the summit was thin, and the shadows of the 20th century were beginning to lengthen. The stage was set for the political assassinations, the drug-fueled collapses, and the tragic accidents that would eventually be woven together into the dark tapestry known as the Guinness curse. As the 19th century dissolved into the 20th, the Guinness dynasty stood atop a mountain of black gold so vast it seemed beyond the reach of gravity. Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Earl of Iveagh, had transformed a brewery into a sovereign financial state. By 1900, the St. James's Gate Brewery was not merely the largest in the world. It was a technological marvel of the Edwardian era, employing over 3,000 workers and producing nearly 2 million barrels of stout annually. From a macroeconomic perspective, the Guinnesses had achieved absolute market dominance. They did not merely sell a product, they owned the palate of the British Empire. Yet, it was precisely at this moment of maximum structural integrity that the Gilded vacuum began to exert its subtle, destructive pressure on the family's psychological and political foundations. The early 1900s represented the brittle summit of the dynasty. While the ledgers showed record-breaking dividends, the geopolitical landscape was shifting beneath their feet. The Guinnesses were the ultimate beneficiaries of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, a social class of Protestant elites who owned the land and held the power. However, the rising tide of Irish nationalism and the Home Rule movement posed an existential threat to this world order. For Edward Cecil and his sons, the brewery was an imperial institution, inextricably linked to the crown. Their refusal to align with the growing thirst for Irish independence created the first major fracture in their social capital. They were becoming stranger kings in their own land, adored for their philanthropy and the jobs they provided, but increasingly alienated from the political heartbeat of the nation they had helped build. The first decade of the century was characterized by a frantic attempt to further insulate the family from the volatility of the real world through extravagant acquisition. This was the era of the Guinness palaces. Edward Cecil's residences, Elvedon Hall in Suffolk, Farmley in Dublin, and his mansion at 80 Stephen's Green, were not merely homes, they were fortifications of wealth. Elvedon Hall, in particular, was transformed into an Orientalist fantasy, with a marble-clad Indian hall that required a permanent army of servants to maintain. Economically, this was dead capital, or wealth pulled out of the productive industrial cycle of the brewery and frozen into high-maintenance vanity assets. For the younger generation, growing up in these palaces meant a total disconnect from the realities of labor and trade. They were raised in a world where every obstacle was preemptively removed by a checkbook, a condition that modern psychologists call affluenza, which robs an individual of the resilience quotient necessary to survive a crisis. Then came 1914, and the Gilded vacuum was violently punctured by the First World War. The Great War was the first Black Swan event for the modern Guinness Corporation. While the brewery initially benefited from military contracts, sending millions of bottles to the front lines to fortify the troops, the human cost to the family began to reveal the first true cracks in the Guinness curse. The family's deep-seated sense of noblesse oblige and imperial duty meant that the sons of the dynasty did not hide behind their desks. They went to the front. The psychological toll of the war on the Guinness heirs was immense. They left the insulated safety of their estates for the muddy, egalitarian slaughterhouse of the trenches. For the first time, the Guinness name offered no protection against machine guns and mustard gas. While many survived, they returned to a world that was unrecognizable. The old Edwardian certainty was dead. The war had shattered the illusion that wealth and Tokyo could guarantee a peaceful, orderly existence. The curse extended to their social and professional lives. Brian Guinness suffered a highly public humiliation when his wife, Diana Mitford, abandoned him for Sir Oswald Mosley, marrying the fascist leader in Berlin with Adolf Hitler as a guest. Meanwhile, Ken Elmley Guinness, a brilliant racing driver and inventor of the KLG spark plug, suffered severe head injuries in a 1924 crash that killed his mechanic. Plagued by delusions, he tragically gassed himself in 1937. This post-war malaise, a mixture of survivor's guilt and existential drift, became the fertile soil in which the darker aspects of the family legacy began to grow. Simultaneously, the domestic front in Ireland erupted. The 1916 Easter Rising and the subsequent War of Independence placed the Guinnesses in a precarious position. The brewery, once a symbol of Irish industrial pride, was now viewed by some revolutionaries as a bastion of British unionism. During the Rising, the brewery's fleet of trucks was commandeered, and its workers were caught in the crossfire. The family's political influence, once absolute, was now a liability. They were forced to navigate a zero-sum game of identity. Were they Irish industrial titans or British aristocrats? Their inability to reconcile these two halves of their identity led to a period of institutional anxiety. They began to move their financial headquarters and their primary residences toward London, a strategic retreat that signaled the beginning of the end of their era as the undisputed masters of Dublin. By 1920, the first generation of the 20th century had reached adulthood, but they were a different breed than their iron-willed ancestors. They were the bright young things, a generation characterized by a desperate, hedonistic search for meaning in the wake of the war's trauma. Among them was Walter Edward Guinness, the future Lord Moyne, who would later become one of the curse's most high-profile victims. Walter was brilliant, a decorated war hero and a rising political star, but even he could not escape the sense of dynastic displacement. The wealth was now so vast, and the institution so self-running, that the heirs felt like mere caretakers of a museum rather than builders of an empire. Economically, the 1920s brought the onset of global competition and the first signs of market saturation in the UK. The family responded by doubling down on marketing and branding, launching the iconic "Guinness is good for you" campaign. While this was a commercial triumph, as it further abstracted the family from the actual process of production, they were now selling an image, a myth, and a medicalized promise of health. But behind the posters of smiling ostriches and toucans, the family was becoming increasingly fragmented. The 9,000-year lease, once a symbol of eternal stability, was now starting to feel like a 9,000-year sentence. The stage was set for the mid-century, where the political cracks would turn into violent ruptures, and the personal drift would spiral into the drug-fueled collapses of the 1960s. The summit had been reached. The descent had begun. As the 1920s roared into the 1930s, the Guinness family found themselves in a state of gilded stagnation. The brewery at St. James's Gate continued to pump out millions of barrels with mechanical efficiency, but the family's role had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer the grimy-handed industrial pioneers of the 18th century. They had become figures of high society intrigue and high-stakes imperial politics. This was the era of the third and fourth generations, men and women born into a wealth so absolute that the very concept of work had become a theoretical abstraction, a hobby rather than a necessity. The 9,000-year lease, once a symbol of Arthur I's audacity and earthly ambition, now served as the invisible walls of a psychological fortress. The family was no longer building a business, they were managing a legend, and the sheer atmospheric pressure of that legend was beginning to crush the individual spirits of its heirs. The macroeconomic landscape of the 1930s provided a deceptive and dangerous sense of security. While the Great Depression ravaged the global economy, toppling banks and starving cities, Guinness remained remarkably resilient. Alcohol, as a counter-cyclical commodity, often thrives during economic downturns as the public seeks solace in affordable luxuries. However, the family's decision to move their corporate headquarters from Dublin to London in 1932 was a watershed moment of profound symbolic significance. This was not merely a tax-saving maneuver or a response to the Irish Free State's protectionist policies. It was a final, symbolic severance from their Irish roots. The Guinnesses were choosing to be imperial citizens of the world rather than Irish industrialists. This move further deepened the dynastic displacement of the younger generation. They were heirs to an Irish empire, but lived as English aristocrats, creating a fragmented, hyphenated sense of self that left them vulnerable to the existential malaise and identity crises that would soon define the Guinness curse. The primary figure of this era, and the man who most clearly embodied this imperial transition, was Walter Edward Guinness, later created the first Baron Moyne. Walter was, in many ways, the last of the great Guinness titans, a man of immense intellect, a decorated lieutenant colonel in World War I, and a formidable figure in the British Conservative Party. He served as the British Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and later as the Secretary of State for the colonies. To the outside world, Lord Moyne was the personification of British stability and Guinness prestige. But his life also embodied the family's increasing proximity to the violent ruptures of mid-century geopolitics. He was a man of the old order attempting to manage a world that was rapidly decolonizing and radicalizing. As World War II erupted, the Guinness family's deep-seated sense of noblesse oblige once again forced them onto the global stage. But unlike the First War, where the tragedy was found in the mud of the trenches, the tragedies of this era were found in the shadows of political extremism and ideological zealotry. Lord Moyne was appointed the British Resident Minister of State in the Middle East, based in Cairo. It was a role of immense power, overseeing the British war effort in a region that was a tinderbox of conflicting interests: Arab nationalism, Zionist aspirations, and British imperial survival. On November 6, 1944, the Guinness curse manifested in its most violent and public political form. As Lord Moyne returned to his villa in Cairo, two members of the Zionist militant group Lehi, the Stern Gang, were waiting in the shadows. They fired 3 shots at point-blank range, ending the life of one of Britain's most capable administrators. The assassination of Lord Moyne sent shockwaves through the British Empire and devastated the internal cohesion of the Guinness family. From an economic and social standpoint, the murder was a black swan event that proved wealth, castles, and peerages could not provide sanctuary from the ideological storms of the 20th century. For the family, the loss of Walter was the loss of their primary political anchor, and he was the man who had bridged the gap between the industrial vats of Dublin and the highest halls of Westminster. His death left a leadership vacuum and a profound, haunting sense of vulnerability that no amount of dividends could heal. The message to the younger heirs was clear and terrifying. No matter how high the family climbed, or how far they moved from the source of their wealth, the shadow of their name, and the political baggage it carried, would always find them. While Lord Moyne's tragedy was public and historic, other members of the family were suffering from a more private, insidious version of the curse: the total erosion of purpose. The 1930s and 40s saw a rise in hedonistic despair among the younger heirs. Deprived of the biological and economic need to struggle, and insulated from the horrors of the Great Depression by their trust funds, many turned to the bright young things lifestyle, a frantic whirlwind of jazz, excessive drinking, and high-stakes social maneuvering. Among them were figures like Lady Honor Guinness and her siblings, who moved through the salons of London and the villas of the French Riviera with a sense of frantic, drug-adjacent boredom. This was the beginning of the substance abuse cycle that would reach its catastrophic peak in the 1960s. Without the industrial discipline of their ancestors, the wealth was becoming a slow-acting poison rather than a resource for growth. Economically, the war years, 1939 to 1945, forced the brewery into a state of war management and institutional professionalization. Shortages of grain and labor, combined with heavy taxation, and slowed the frantic growth of the Victorian era. The company became a vital cog in the British war machine, producing stout for the troops and navigating the complex emergency regulations in Ireland. But the family was increasingly absent from the day-to-day operations at St. James's Gate. The professionalization of the company meant that non-family managers, men with degrees in science and business rather than Guinness blood, were now running the vats. The Guinness heirs were now rentiers, living off dividends and capital gains, further removing them from the grit, the heat, and the reality of the industry that bore their name. By 1945, as the world celebrated the end of the war, the Guinness family was fundamentally changed. They had lost their political giant in Cairo. They had moved their spiritual and corporate soul to London. And their younger generation was drifting toward a future of privilege without purpose. The golden cage had evolved into a gilded labyrinth of social expectations and psychological drift. They were wealthier than ever in absolute terms, but their internal cohesion was shattered. The 9,000-year lease was nearing its 186th num, and the cracks in the foundation were no longer just visible. They were structural. The family was entering the second half of the 20th century as a house divided, setting the stage for the counterculture collapses, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll tragedies and the eventual loss of the company itself that would soon turn the Guinness curse from a family secret into a global headline. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 did not merely signal the end of global hostilities. For the Guinness dynasty, it marked the beginning of a profound and irreversible psychological metamorphosis. While the global economy entered a period of unprecedented expansion, the golden age of capitalism, the internal cohesion of the Guinness family began to undergo a process of rapid radioactive decay. The generation that emerged from the long shadows of the 1940s was no longer tethered to the iron-willed industrial discipline of Arthur I, or the rigid imperial duty that had defined Lord Moyne. They were the inheritors of a 9,000-year promise, but for many of the heirs, that promise had begun to feel like an ancient, suffocating weight rather than a foundational strength. From a macroeconomic perspective, the 1950s were years of staggering, almost effortless profit. The post-war rebuilding of Europe, the Marshall Plan, and the rise of a new global consumer class drove Guinness sales to historic, astronomical heights. St. James's Gate was no longer just a brewery. It was a cash flow machine that operated with the cold efficiency of a central bank. However, this immense financial surplus acted as a double-edged sword. In previous generations, the threat of competition or the need to innovate had provided a biological and psychological necessity for struggle, a friction that forged the character of the family's leaders. By 1950, that friction had vanished. The younger generation was provided with an infinite safety net, a level of liquid wealth that removed the very concept of consequence from their lives. In the absence of a professional purpose or a survivalist drive, many of the younger heirs fell into a state of existential drift, a psychological condition where the abundance of choice leads to a paralysis of the soul. This era saw the rise of what social historians call the socialite Guinness, men and women whose primary occupation was the curation of their own celebrity and the pursuit of increasingly extreme forms of stimulation. The golden cage had become so comfortable, so perfectly insulated by trust funds and private estates, that its inhabitants began to lose the fundamental strength required to even stand within it. The transition from industrial titans to rentier aristocrats was now complete. The families linked to the actual production of stout, the physical heat of the fermentation vats, the logistical grit of the brewery floor, and the scientific rigors of the laboratory was effectively severed. They were now a class defined not by what they contributed to the world's economy, but by the staggering dividends they extracted from it. The primary structural crack during this period was the total erosion of the family identity. For nearly 2 centuries, to be a Guinness meant to be a steward of a national institution, a guardian of a legacy that was larger than any individual. By the mid-1950s, however, the family had fragmented into various competing and often estranged branches. Many of these heirs were more interested in the burgeoning London counterculture, the avant-garde art world of Paris, and the decadent social circuits of the Mediterranean than in the quarterly reports from Dublin. They were wealthy beyond the dreams of most mortals, but they were also increasingly atomized, isolated individuals bound only by a shared surname and a common legal department. The sense of being a corporate family, a unified dynastic force, was replaced by a collection of affluent strangers. This fragmentation made the family uniquely susceptible to the substance abuse cycle that was beginning to seep into the upper echelons of British and Irish high society. The quiet, disciplined alcoholism that had occasionally plagued the Victorian Guinnesses, often masked by the health benefits of their own product, was being replaced by something far more volatile and destructive. The 1950s introduced a new era of pharmaceutical and social rebellion. In the search for a real experience outside their gilded bubble, the younger heirs began to experiment with the sedatives and stimulants that were becoming the subtext of the jet-set lifestyle. It was a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, in a world where every desire was met before it was even fully formed. The psychological toll of the curse during these years often manifested as a profound, aching sense of isolation. Born into a name that was literally written on every street corner and etched into the glass of every pub, the younger Guinnesses struggled with a debilitating form of imposter syndrome. They were celebrated for achievements they did not earn, respected for a legacy they did not build, and feared for a power they did not know how to wield. To escape this suffocating shadow, many sought to subvert the family image entirely. They traded the silent, dignified pews of St. Patrick's Cathedral for the smoke-filled, chaotic jazz clubs of Soho. They exchanged the stiff, formal dinners of Farmley for the sun-drenched, drug-adjacent decadence of villas in the south of France. This was a generation in search of a real identity, but the tragedy lay in the fact that they were searching for it in the very places designed to destroy it. As they drifted further into the gilded labyrinth of 1950s hedonism, they were unknowingly setting the stage for the explosive and tragic collisions of the 1960s. The stoic, industrial ideal of the Guinness titan, the man of iron will and civic duty, was officially dead. In his place stood a generation of beautiful and damned heirs, individuals who possessed the keys to the kingdom but had forgotten why the kingdom was built in the first place. By the time the 1950s drew to a close, the Guinness family was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. They had the money, they had the titles, and they had the 9,000-year lease, but they had lost their North Star. The industrial discipline that had saved them during the 18th century and the imperial duty that had guided them through the 19th were gone. As they stood on the threshold of the 1960s, the decade of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the family was more vulnerable than it had ever been. The Guinness curse was no longer a whispered rumor in the hallways of their mansions. It was becoming a structural reality, a debt of character that was finally coming due. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here, and the first victims were already starting to fall into the abyss of their own extraordinary privilege. The 1960s arrived not as a decade of progress for the Guinness dynasty, but as a high-speed collision between ancient aristocratic expectations and the explosive reality of the counterculture. If the 1950s had been a period of existential drift, the 1960s were the years of active disintegration. The wall of the golden cage had finally become porous, allowing the hedonistic, drug-fueled energy of swinging London to pour into the hushed hallways of the Guinness mansions. This was the era where the Guinness curse transitioned from a whispered family anxiety into a loud, public tragedy, personified by the meteoric rise and horrific fall of the family's most charismatic heir, Tara Brown. From a macroeconomic perspective, the brewery at St. James's Gate was undergoing a process of decoupling. By 1960, the Guinness Company was a global conglomerate, managed by a tier of elite, non-family professionals who operated with the cold logic of modern finance. The family members were no longer the captains of industry. They were the beneficiaries of the machine. This separation created a dangerous psychological vacuum. The younger generation possessed the financial power of emperors but lacked the structural responsibilities that had grounded their ancestors. They were industrial royalty without a kingdom to rule, leading them to seek meaning in the burgeoning world of rock and roll, avant-garde fashion, and the psychedelic revolution. The focal point of this era's tragedy was Tara Brown, the son of Dominic Brown, 4th Baron Oranmore and Brown, and Una Guinness. Tara was the quintessential golden boy of the 1960s. Wealthy, aristocratically beautiful, and possessed of a restless, magnetic energy, he was a fixture of the London elite. He was a close friend to Paul McCartney and John Lennon, a man who bridged the gap between the stuffy world of the Anglo-Irish peerage and the rebellious brilliance of the Beatles. Tara lived at the intersection of extreme privilege and extreme risk. He spent his inheritance on a collection of high-performance cars and a lifestyle that operated at a permanent, frantic tempo. Tara Brown's life was an attempt to outrun the Guinness name. He sought an identity that was defined by his own style and his own associations rather than the black silk of the family stout. However, the 9,000-year legacy is not easily outrun. On the night of December 18, 1966, the curse manifested in a twisted wreck of metal. Tara was driving his white Lotus Elan through South Kensington at high speed. In a split-second decision that some witnesses described as an act of nobility, swerving to avoid a large vehicle and thus saving the life of his passenger, model Suki Potier, Tara crashed into a parked van. He was 21 years old. The death of Tara Brown was a cultural supernova. It was immortalized in the opening verses of the Beatles' masterpiece, A Day in the Life. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. But for the Guinness family, It was a structural rupture. Tara's death proved that the infinite safety net of the family fortune was an illusion. No amount of wealth could buy a second of time back from a fatal impact. His death signaled the end of the beautiful and damned era and the beginning of a darker, more somber period of the curse. The tragic narrative of Tara Brown wasn't the only artistic casualty. Lady Caroline Blackwood, another heiress known as a dazzling muse to geniuses like Lucian Freud and Robert Lowell, saw her life overshadowed by severe alcoholism, horrific marriages, and an environment of Gothic neglect. It was the ultimate sacrifice of the golden boy to the altar of the family's monumental success. Following Tara's death, the disintegration of the family's psychological health accelerated. The 1960s had introduced the family to the pharmaceutical frontier. The hedonistic despair of the previous decade had now evolved into full-blown substance abuse. The heirs were no longer just drinking. They were experimenting with LSD, heroin, and high-dosage sedatives. The Gilded labyrinth was now filled with smoke and chemical haze. The suicide of Lady Henrietta Guinness in 1978, who leaped from a bridge in Italy, can be traced back to the emotional and psychological trauma of this era. She, like many of her cousins, found the Guinness name to be a brand of Cain rather than a badge of honor. She once famously remarked that if she had been born poor, she might have been happy. Her tragedy was the ultimate indictment of the golden cage. Economically, the 1960s saw the brewery struggle to adapt to the changing tastes of a younger, more rebellious consumer base. The Guinness is good for you medicalized branding of the past was falling out of favor. The company responded by diversifying into the pharmaceutical and plastics industries, and a move that further diluted the family's connection to the original craft of Arthur I. They were chasing conglomerate growth to satisfy the ever-increasing demand for dividends from a family that was now sprawling and fragmented. The brewery was no longer a passion. It was a dividend utility designed to fund the increasingly expensive and often destructive lifestyles of its owners. By 1970, as the smoke of the 1960s cleared, the Guinness dynasty was a shadow of its Victorian self. They had lost their most promising heir to a car crash. They had lost their moral authority to the counterculture, and they were beginning to lose their grip on the company itself. The 9,000-year lease was now a haunting reminder of a stability that no longer existed. The family had traded their industrial soul for social celebrity, and the bill was coming due. The stage was set for the 1980s, the decade of the corporate vultures and the share trading scandals, where the family would finally lose control of the empire that Arthur I had built with a pickaxe and a prayer. The curse had moved from the bloodline to the boardroom, and the end was finally in sight. As the calendar turned to the 1970s, the Guinness dynasty was entering a phase of structural exhaustion. For over 2 centuries, the family had functioned as a cohesive unit of industrial and social power. But the cultural revolutions of the previous decade had left the family's psychological foundations in ruins. The 9,000-year lease at St. James's Gate, which had once been a symbol of eternal stability and audacious confidence, began to feel like an iron weight, a reminder of a stoic, disciplined past that the current generation could no longer inhabit. This decade marked the true beginning of the value collapse, where the family's traditional roles as philanthropists, industrial titans, and moral guardians were systematically dismantled by internal apathy and external economic volatility. From a macroeconomic perspective, the 1970s presented a perfect storm of challenges for the Guinness Company. Ireland and the United Kingdom were mired in stagflation, a toxic combination of stagnant economic growth and rampant inflation. For a company whose primary asset was a fixed-rate lease and a centuries-old product, the erosion of the British pound's purchasing power was a direct hit to the family's liquid wealth. Furthermore, the brewing industry was shifting toward corporate consolidation. The artisanal, family-led model that had served the Guinnesses since 1759 was being rendered obsolete by the rise of multinational beverage conglomerates. To survive, Guinness had to act like a predator, but the family members were increasingly becoming the prey of their own privilege. The internal crisis of the 1970s was characterized by the professional divorce. The family had already handed over day-to-day management to external executives in the 1960s, but in the 1970s, this gap widened into a chasm. The Guinness heirs were no longer seen in the boardrooms. They were seen in the tabloids. The socialite Guinness had evolved into the tragic Guinness. The wealth that had once built cathedrals was now being used to fund a desperate, frantic search for meaning in an increasingly cynical world. The family's identity was no longer rooted in Dublin's industrial grit, but in the transient, smoke-filled salons of Mayfair and the high-stakes casinos of Monte Carlo. They were living off the momentum of their ancestors, a phenomenon known in economics as capital consumption, where the heirs spend the principal of their legacy rather than just the interest. The psychological manifestation of the curse during this period was defined by a series of private collapses that signaled the end of the Guinnesses as a moral institution. The most poignant example was the struggle of Lady Henrietta Guinness. Born into the height of the family's 20th century prestige, Henrietta felt the crushing weight of the golden cage more acutely than perhaps any other member of her generation. She was a woman of immense sensitivity who famously stated that she would have been happier if she had been born into a family with no name and no fortune. In 1978, the pressure of the family's legacy and her own personal demons became unbearable. While in Italy, she leaped from the Ponte delle Torri, a medieval bridge in Spoleto. Her death was not just a personal tragedy, as it was a structural indictment of the family's gilded vacuum. It sent a clear message to the world. The Guinness name was no longer a badge of success, but a mark of existential suffering. The year 1978 unleashed an avalanche of misery. Alongside Henrietta's suicide, 18-year-old Natalia Guinness died from a heroin overdose after falling in a bathtub. A car crash killed 4-year-old Peter Guinness, and Major Dennis Guinness was found dead. The nightmare continued into the 80s. Jennifer Guinness was violently kidnapped for a $2.6 million ransom and held for 8 days, only to watch her husband John fall 500 feet to his death 2 years later. Shortly after, 22-year-old heiress Olivia Channon was found dead from a heroin overdose at Oxford. Economically, the 1970s forced the company into a series of desperate diversifications. Under the pressure to maintain the high dividends required to fund the family's increasingly expensive and often destructive lifestyles, the company began to move away from its core product. They invested in everything from film production and holiday resorts to plastics and pharmaceuticals. This conglomerate strategy was a classic sign of a company losing its North Star. By moving away from the black gold of Arthur I, they were diluting the brand's unique value proposition. Every time the company invested in a non-brewing asset, it further severed the family's emotional and historical connection to St. James's Gate. They were no longer the brewers to the world. They were a sprawling, unfocused investment trust that happened to own a brewery. The 1970s also saw the shadow of the Troubles in Ireland cast a dark pall over the family's remaining Irish assets. As violence escalated in Northern Ireland and spilled over into the Republic, the Guinnesses' identity as Anglo-Irish aristocrats became a political liability once again. The brewery at St. James's Gate, once a symbol of national pride, was now viewed by some through the lens of colonial history. This political tension accelerated the family's capital flight to London, leaving their ancestral homes like Farmley as ghost-like reminders of a vanished era of dominance. They were a family in retreat, hiding behind the walls of their London mansions as the world they had helped build began to turn against them. They had lost their industrial focus through reckless diversification, and they were beginning to lose their grip on the 9,000-year destiny. The golden cage was no longer a place of protection. It was a prison of their own making. The stage was set for the mid-1980s, where the financial vultures would finally descend. The arrival of Ernest Saunders and the subsequent share trading scandal would be the final blow to the family's reputation, proving that when the 9,000-year anchor is lost, the ship of state is easily wrecked. The transition from the Golden Age to the Age of Scandal was complete, and the Guinness family was about to face the ultimate test of their survival as they walked blindly into the boardroom wars of the 1980s. By the onset of the 1980s, the Guinness dynasty was no longer a unified industrial force. It was a fractured collection of aristocrats who had outsourced their survival to the cold, calculating world of modern corporate management. The 9,000-year lease was still legally binding, but the spirit of Arthur I, the hands-on, risk-taking entrepreneur, had been entirely replaced by a desperate need for ever-increasing dividends to fund a lifestyle that the family could no longer justify. This decade represented the final, violent rupture in the golden cage. It was the era of the corporate vulture, where the family's legacy was handed over to a man who would simultaneously save the company's finances and incinerate its 200-year-old reputation: Ernest Saunders. From a macroeconomic perspective, the early 1980s were the years of Thatcherism and Reaganomics, a period of aggressive deregulation, hostile takeovers, glorification of short-term shareholder value. The Guinness Company, which had spent the 1970s mired in a stagnant, unfocused portfolio of non-core assets, from film production to plastics, was a prime target for a corporate raid. To prevent the loss of the brewery, the board made a fateful decision in 1981. They hired Ernest Saunders as CEO. While Saunders reigned as the aggressive outsider king, he did not operate in a vacuum. The Guinness family, holding key board seats, provided the silent assent for this predatory order. Their retreat into passive oversight created a moral bypass for Saunders, a man who saw the Guinness name not as a heritage to protect, but as an undervalued asset to be weaponized for short-term conquest. Under Saunders, the company underwent a draconian rationalization, and he ruthlessly divested over 150 non-core businesses, refocusing the firm entirely on the beverage industry. This was a surgical success, but it came at a profound social cost. The paternalistic bond between the family and the workers, which had existed since the 18th century, was finally severed in favor of pure efficiency. But Saunders' ultimate goal was inorganic growth, expansion through massive acquisitions. In 1986, he launched a hostile £2.5 billion bid for Distillers, the Scottish spirits giant that owned brands like Johnnie Walker and Gordon's Gin. This move was intended to turn Guinness into the world's most powerful drinks conglomerate, but it would instead become the setting for the scandal of the century. The Guinness share trading scandal remains one of the most infamous episodes in the history of the London Stock Exchange. To ensure the success of the Distillers takeover, Saunders and a group of high-profile associates, dubbed the Guinness Four, allegedly orchestrated an illegal share manipulation scheme. They used the company's own funds to secretly buy Guinness shares, artificially inflating the stock price to make their bid more attractive. It was a classic case of corporate hubris, a gilded crime committed by men who believed they were above the regulatory laws of the land. When the scheme was uncovered by the Department of Trade and Industry in late 1986, the backlash was nuclear. For the Guinness family, the scandal was the ultimate value collapse. For over 2 centuries, the family name had been synonymous with integrity, philanthropy, and moral stability. In a matter of months, that name was dragged through the mud of criminal courts and front-page headlines. The scandal was not just a failure of one man, but a systemic collapse of dynastic governance. The family's complicity lay in their appetite for the massive dividends Saunders produced, turning a blind eye to the gilded crimes committed in their name. By the time the fraud was unmasked, the Guinnesses had traded their 200-year-old integrity for a fleeting spike in market capitalization. They had allowed a mercenary to take the helm, and in doing so, they had lost the moral right to lead. The 9,000-year anchor had been cut loose, and the family's control over the company began to dissolve in a sea of litigation and public disgrace. Saunders was eventually sentenced to prison, but the damage to the Guinness reputation was irreversible. The psychological toll of this era on the remaining family members was devastating. The Guinness curse had now moved from the personal to the institutional. The 1980s saw a spike in what sociologists call status anxiety within the family. They were still among the wealthiest people in the world, but they were now pariahs of the boardroom. The pride that had once sustained the dynasty was replaced by a deep-seated sense of shame. Many of the younger heirs sought to distance themselves further from the family name, changing their identities or retreating into total anonymity. The golden cage had lost its luster. It was now just a prison of notoriety. Economically, the fallout of the scandal forced a radical restructuring that effectively signaled the end of the Guinness empire as a family-led entity. The company merged with Grand Metropolitan in 1997 to form Diageo, a massive, faceless multinational corporation. While the Guinness family remained significant shareholders, they were no longer the architects of eternity. They were reduced to passive investors, their influence diluted in a sea of institutional capital. Though the 9,000-year lease was actually voided when the company bought out an additional 50 acres to expand their empire, its mythical legacy remains. The original 45-pound contract is a ghost of Arthur's eternal ambition, but the family that signed it is no longer at the helm. As the 1990s approached, the Guinness dynasty was a shadow of its former self. They had survived the famine, the world wars, and the Irish Revolution, but they could not survive the corrosion of values that came with the pursuit of absolute corporate power. They had traded their industrial soul for market capitalization, and in the process, they had lost the very thing that made them unique. The decade ended with the family in retreat, their ancestral homes being sold or turned into museums, and their children struggling to find a purpose in a world where the name Guinness was associated more with a court case than a cathedral. The stage was set for the 21st century, the final chapter where the family would have to decide whether to remain prisoners of their own curse or to finally break free from the golden cage and forge a new, humbler path forward. As the Guinness family crossed the threshold into the 21st century, the golden cage that had defined their existence for over 200 years underwent a final, structural transformation. The decade of the 1980s and the subsequent merger into Diageo in 1997 had effectively ended the family's role as industrial monarchs. No longer were they the direct stewards of the vats at St. James's Gate. They had become a liquid dynasty, wealthy, prestigious, but fundamentally disconnected from the physical production of the black silk that bore their name. This era represents the dispersion phase, where the family's vast social and financial capital began to fragment into dozens of individual paths, some leading to renewed purpose and others into the final, lingering shadows of the ancient curse. From a macroeconomic and institutional perspective, the 21st century saw the Guinness brand achieve a level of global ubiquity that Arthur I could never have imagined. Under the management of Diageo, the brewery at St. James's Gate became one of the most successful tourist attractions in the world, and a cornerstone of Ireland's modern economic identity. However, for the family, this success was bittersweet. They were now honorary observers of their own legacy. The 9,000-year lease was still in effect, a legal ghost of Arthur's eternal ambition. But the family's influence was now confined to boardrooms where they were just one group of shareholders among thousands. The industrial engine had become a faceless corporate entity, and the family's primary challenge was no longer managing a brewery, but managing the psychological burden of a famous last name in a world that no longer recognized the concept of noblesse oblige. The internal reality of the 21st century Guinnesses is characterized by a dual identity. On one hand, there are the successful descendants who have used their inheritance to forge new paths in art, conservation, and fashion. Figures like Daphne Guinness, the daughter of Jonathan Guinness, 3rd Baron Moyne, have become icons of the avant-garde. Daphne, with her high-fashion armor and obsession with artistic perfection, can be seen as a modern interpretation of the family's creative spirit. Yet, even her life is shadowed by the weight of the past. She has often spoken about the isolation that comes with such extreme wealth and the haunting quality of the family's history. For this branch of the family, the golden cage has been traded for the velvet spotlight, a different kind of confinement where one is constantly judged against the monumental achievements of ancestors long dead. However, the Guinness curse has not entirely faded into the history books. The 21st century has seen the final, tragic ripples of the family's psychological fragility. In 2020, the death of Honor Uloth, the 19-year-old granddaughter of Benjamin Guinness, the 3rd Earl of Iveagh, sent a shiver through the family's remaining cohesion. Her accidental death in a swimming pool at a family estate was a cruel reminder that despite their billions and their centuries of privilege, the family remained uniquely susceptible to sudden, senseless tragedy. It reinforced the public's fascination with the idea that the Guinness name carried a specific kind of fate, and a dark tax that must be paid for the extraordinary success of the 18th and 19th centuries. Economically, the modern Guinness heirs are masters of wealth preservation rather than wealth creation. Their assets are managed by family offices and private banks, shielded from the volatility of the markets, but also from the creative destruction of the entrepreneurship that built the empire. They are the guardians of a dead legacy, living in a world where their primary social value is their proximity to a famous past. This has led to a profound purpose crisis among some members of the younger generation. Without the brewery to run or the state to advise, what is a Guinness for? Some have answered this by retreating into total anonymity, shedding their titles and their history to live ordinary lives. Others have turned to philanthropy, attempting to reclaim the moral ground that was lost during the scandals of the 1980s. Today, the Guinness family exists as a collection of individuals rather than a unified dynasty. Even seemingly safe moments turned lethal, like in 1998 when Rose Nugent was crushed to death by her own horse-drawn caravan on her mother's birthday. Yet, the current head of the dynasty, Ned Guinness, the 4th Earl of Iveagh, laughs off the curse as dreamt up, calling them the luckiest family alive. Still, the allure of their dark history remains undeniable, so much so that Netflix recently resurrected their 19th century succession battles in the hit series House of Guinness. What remains is a name that has become a global metaphor for Irishness, quality, and mysterious tragedy. The golden cage has been dismantled piece by piece, as the family's wealth and influence have dispersed into the global elite. They are no longer the Rockefellers of the old world. They are a case study in the life cycle of a dynasty, from audacious creation to industrial dominance, through imperial duty and social decadence, ending in a quiet, fragmented present. The curse, if it ever truly existed, was perhaps nothing more than the inevitable psychological cost of building a legacy intended to last forever in a world defined by constant change. As we look back at the sweep of the Guinness saga, from the dilapidated brewery at St. James's Gate in 1759 to the globalized boardrooms of the 21st century, we are left to contemplate the true nature of what the world calls the Guinness curse. Is it a supernatural debt, or is it a predictable, a human consequence of a family attempting to live within a time frame that no individual life can sustain? The 9,000-year lease was Arthur I's greatest achievement, but it was also his most unintentional burden. It created a psychological environment where the future was already written, leaving his descendants to struggle with the paradox of having everything while possessing nothing of their own making. The story of the Guinnesses is, at its core, a study of the gilded vacuum. The Guinness saga eventually collided with the universal three-generation rule, the sociological observation where the first generation builds, the second preserves, and the third dissipates. While the family miraculously defied this law for 5 generations through strict industrial discipline, they eventually succumbed when the wealth was no longer anchored to the brewery floor. Once the family transitioned from creators to consumers of their legacy, the spiritual and operational glue of the dynasty began to dissolve into the fragmented lives of the jet-set era. It demonstrates that absolute wealth, when decoupled from a professional or social purpose, becomes a corrosive force. The early generations were anchored by the grit of the industry and the duty of the state. They were industrial stoics who understood that their privilege was a tool for building a nation. However, as the 19th century titans gave way to the 20th century socialites, that anchor was lost. The golden cage became a place of sensory deprivation, where the absence of struggle led to the search for artificial stimulation in the form of high-speed cars, pharmaceutical escapes, and the frantic hedonism of the jet-set era. The curse, then, can be viewed as a structural failure of the inherited identity. Every Guinness heir was born into a narrative that was already at its climax. When you are born at the top of the mountain, there is nowhere to go but down, or to stay still and watch the air grow thin. The tragedies, the assassinations, the accidents, the suicides, were the violent ruptures of a family trying to break free from a script they did not write. They were attempts to find a human scale in a dynastic reality. Economically, the Guinness legacy has survived because it was transformed from a family business into a global institution. The brand is now larger than the bloodline. St. James's Gate remains a temple to Irish industry, but the gods who built it have been replaced by the cold, efficient logic of multinational capital. This is perhaps the ultimate irony of Arthur's 9,000-year vision. The business achieved the immortality he craved, but the family could not. The company outlived the dynasty's ability to lead it, proving that while capital can be inherited, the entrepreneurial spirit and the moral compass must be earned by each generation anew. As the 21st century continues, the Guinnesses serve as a mirror for our own societal obsessions with wealth and legacy. They remind us that the most expensive thing one can own is a famous last name, and that the golden cage is most dangerous when it is most comfortable. The 9,000-year lease still has vast eons to run, but the story of the Guinness family as we knew it has reached its end. So what remains is the lesson that true wealth is not found in the dividends of the past, but in the purpose of the present. The black gold still pours, and the name still echoes, but the curse is finally broken, not by a miracle, but by the simple, quiet dispersal of a family back into the ordinary stream of human life.